about totally new forms of data analytics, and it brings to the fore the role of modelling in our research frameworks and how we think about modelling. New ball game, really challenging, and that of course is linked to the whole issue of how we think about e-research and digital scholarship, and the interesting discussion that's emerging around what, for example, might the digital humanities be, and so forth. Now in that context, putting my CSRO hat back on for just a moment, we're saying to ourselves, okay, what are the emerging capability challenges that gives rise to where we need to invest in developing new capabilities? And that whole area of next generation data analytics and data representation, which of course also includes some issues around visualisation, modelling and so forth, is of course a key one. The way we develop and roll out sensor networks, the impact of bioengineering right across the board. Fascinating challenges that we need to think about. Then there's a whole lot of issues around how the innovation game is changing in terms of governance and coordination. Recent Nobel Prize winner, Eleanor Ostrom, for example, with her work on the coordination of effort around public commons, is a really good example of this, and of course ties in very closely to our natural interest in things like the frameworks for open source development and Creative Commons and so forth. But we're very early stage in thinking about how we apply the lessons we've learned from things like the open source movement to the broader governance frameworks for coordinating effort around addressing broader wicked problems like cities, like population health and so forth. And I think what we're also seeing, fortunately, and perhaps a bit belatedly, is increased attention to the fact that we face real moral and ethical dilemmas, whether it's in the way we think about the way the media operates, or the issues around privacy, but then of course around human health, the trade-offs we make about the allocation of resources in population health and so forth, in education. And it's a reminder that innovation and social change is not morally and ethically neutral. And I think the humanities and social sciences have a real resurgent role to play in how they actually help address some of those moral and ethical issues, at the same time as we've seen the demise of so many areas of inquiry in our universities and areas like philosophy and so forth, which would equip us to have better discussions about that. And the final game changer for me is the importance of rediscovering what I think has been hugely neglected in our discussion of innovation and creativity, which is the role of intangible assets. I mean, it's fascinating the way that we've focused so much on the issue of intellectual property that we've forgotten about the much broader issue of intellectual capital and the intangible aspect of intellectual capital in terms of know-how, in terms of the wisdom of teams and collaborations, that is immensely and increasingly important, and yet we pay so little attention to how we nurture and exploit and leverage that within our national innovation systems. And of course a key part of that is around social networking and social networks and the social life of information. And there's a whole research agenda, I think, that we're well placed and done some very good preliminary work on how we actually map social networks, how we map social capital, and to do that with purpose of saying how do we enrich our intellectual capital. A very practical example of how we might do that is how we look at creative precincts and innovation precincts, which are really frameworks for social networks and social capital. I'm not far too long, so we're going to jump and come to some concluding remarks around, okay, looking at the big picture and where the emerging opportunities are, and the imperatives, I think, in responding to some of these game changers that I've tried to highlight this morning. And I've tried to summarise them here. It's how we deal with complexity and uncertainty. It's addressing that incredibly important convergence of life and social sciences, and what that means for the sort of collaborations and the skills we need to develop. How we address that challenge of wicked problems. And the reminder, and it's a really important one, that we keep forgetting that innovation is largely and usually a combinatorial game. It's not about inventing a widget or an idea. It's actually about putting together a whole body of knowledge or ideas within new frameworks. And that, of course, is the core of the challenge around addressing and research around wicked problems. And that means we have to get much better at frameworks of collaboration, ways of organising and coordinating collaboration, and think about how ill-equipped we are in terms of our lagging institutional structures and frameworks in supporting and addressing those challenges. I've mentioned, and I just want to keep reinforcing the importance of rediscovering the crucial and central value of the intangible assets around social capital, social networks, and intellectual capital is much more important than intellectual property per se. And then how we map and understand those social and information networks so that we can actually enrich and remove hurdles to information flows and exchange and use. Final point that I'll make, and it's probably a bit more controversial, is the risk we make of distorting our investment and our agenda. There's been some interesting comments in, say, for example, yesterday's Australian Higher Education supplement about that we're putting too much focus on research versus teaching and so forth in our universities. And it makes me think that we've got this obsession, we've developed this obsession with research as equating to the generation of new knowledge, rather than the way we used to talk about the advancement of knowledge and the notion that we build on the shoulders of giants, that knowledge is actually cumulative and that our inherited knowledge only remains useful and alive if we practice it. And so the balance between what I would term scholarship and research, I think we have got quite out of whack. And again, by so focusing on the idea of the new, we forget the importance of reuse of old knowledge, of old insights in new combinations, which was my point about combinatorial innovation being important. And just reinforcing the other point I was making, that innovation and social change is never morally neutral, and how equipped are we and how embedded in our research models and thinking and inquiry is attention to some of those ethical and moral trade-offs, and how we actually develop inquiry to explore those in a useful way, so that we talk about designing better futures, not worse futures. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry. You get a real sense there that the challenges for socio-cultural research and researchers are often the same challenges that those in the natural sciences face. And I think Terry's given a really excellent account of the homology there that's emerging between those kinds of agendas. So there is time for a couple of questions before we go to our next session. So would anyone like to ask Terry or make a comment?
Hi Terry, thanks very much for that. Very inspiring, I found it. The issue of social capital, intellectual capital, that's collaboration, it's working together, it's cooperation, competition policy. I mean, how the two go together, especially in the private areas versus the academic areas and so on?
They do go together. I mean, just take social capital and intellectual capital. I mean, it was a major issue for Adam Smith, for example, because he said knowledge and skill in various trade is embedded in actually the guilds and the groups. It's not codified. So you've got to address the issue about how do you stop people being impeached from one country to another, and there are all these restrictions on the movement of people. So they were far more insight actually into the importance of know-how as embedded intellectual capital than I think we have today. Because, as I say, which becomes so diverted by a false metaphor of how do you monetize intellectual capital. It's property rights. And so that ties then directly into issues around competition policy. If you're looking at the competitiveness of workplaces, workplace innovation, which is often employment and social capital, is something we've neglected hugely, and particularly in the services economy. So all the complaints at the moment about retailers being ripped off by all these offshore online people, GST and that, is a load of nonsense. It's the first time they've become trade exposed to competitive pressure. And that's probably a really good thing, because then I really discover the importance of some of these issues, like know-how, like workplace innovation and so forth. And we can help hugely by saying, how do you think about workplaces as social networks and tools of social capital?
Okay, one more question. Yes, please.
Do you think our politicians genuinely and truly understand the linkages between creativity, innovation, and productivity of the buildings?
No.
I agree with you.
I think in the great tradition of Tony Jones, I'll take it as a comment. You got one comment to make, Brian?
Sorry, I don't know if it's built on past knowledge, not the phrase is great. Inherited knowledge is only useful if it's practiced. It's a great